Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening, and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. George Soros is a Hungarian-born Jewish-American billionaire. His family claims assets of $29 billion, and he uses that wealth to relentlessly undermine the moral principles upon which the United States and Western civilization were founded. He has long been an advocate of open borders. Some of the philanthropic groups he controls have contributed to the migration crisis in Europe. They advertise to potential refugees in Syria that Europe will welcome them. His Open Society Foundation published and widely distributed a pamphlet entitled, "Welcome to Europe." He slammed his home nation of Hungary for trying to protect national borders. Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, called the influx of migrants an invasion and placed much of the blame on Soros. Orban said, "This invasion is driven by those activists who support everything that weakens the nation state." This Western mindset and this activist network is perhaps best represented by George Soros. The Hungarian Prime Minister accused Soros of trying to destroy Western culture, particularly its Christian roots. He said Europeans must stick to our Christian values. Orban believes that Europe can be saved if Europeans take seriously the traditions, the Christian roots, and all the values that are the basis of the civilization of Europe. By the way, that's also true of the United States. It is something that George Soros stands rabidly against. In fact, I believe that cutting Western nations off from their Christian roots is the heart of the Soros agenda. Of course, even he has had to admit that Europe is presently a mess. But instead of saying that it's because of the immigration policies he has championed, he says that European leaders have not correctly executed the policies. Soros recently said, German Chancellor Angela Merkel's decision to open their country's doors wide to refugees was not properly thought out because it ignored the pull factor. A sudden influx of asylum seekers disrupted people in their everyday lives across the EU. What did Soros expect? Maybe someday he will also rethink his position regarding the war on terror. But for now, he thinks it's the biggest problem in the world. Not terrorism, but the war on terrorism. When George W. Bush was president, Soros said, "The main obstacle to a stable and just world order is the United States." When asked to explain, he answered, "By declaring a war on terror after September 11, we set the wrong agenda for the world." Think about that. He's saying that the war on terror is the main obstacle to stable and just world order. And he's spending much of his unbelievably vast fortune supporting groups that want to undermine the war on terror. His wording is interesting. Most people would say a stable and just world. But Soros, he said a stable and just world order. That's because he is a globalist through and through. George Soros wants a one world government, and he wants one people homogenized to think like him. The war on terror that he hates is primarily a war on radical Islam. That's what the United States is fighting, and that's what Israel fights every day just to survive. So despite his Jewish heritage, Soros is a vicious, relentless enemy of Israel. Recently, a batch of emails from his Open Society Foundation was leaked to the public. The Center for American Progress, or CAP, is a think tank that George Soros funds. The leaked emails indicate that Soros used CAP to do opposition research on prominent critics of radical Islam. CAP was founded by John Podesta, the campaign chairman for Hillary Clinton. The point of opposition research in this context is to find a way to damage or ruin the reputations of people being researched. Soros used CAP to dig up dirt on key people who publicly criticize radical Islam. The group decided to research and track the activities of prominent conservatives like David Horowitz, Cliff May, Daniel Pipes, and Liz Cheney. Liz is the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney. One of the memos said CAP's first step will be to interview and engage journalists, researchers, academics, and leaders in the anti-hate movement who are researching and writing on Islamophobia, and to develop a roster of knowledgeable and credible experts to whom journalists and the policymakers can turn for information. This tells us that they believe that to criticize radical Islam is hate. But make no mistake, this is really all about Israel. One email discussed their objective of undermining Israel's image as a democratic state before the international community. There have been a number of successes in challenging Israel's racist and anti-democratic policies in the international arena and influencing EU-Israel bilateral negotiations. It's easy to see the spiritual and prophetic overtones of the worldwide movement against Israel. Groups like CAP ignore the good Israel does. Then they blame Israel when the Palestinian Authority, or Hamas, attack them. In other words, they blame the victim. Israel's critics contend that it is somehow Israel's fault that Hamas hates them and openly wants to destroy them just because they're Jews. The NGO Monitor reports that open society funding contributes significantly to anti-Israel campaigns. It said such funding is aimed at weakening U.S. support for Israel by shifting public opinion regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Iran. What George Soros and the thousands who do his bidding don't seem to understand is that the war on terror is essentially a defensive action. The nations of the world fight terrorism in order not to be overrun by terrorists. To call that destabilizing is absurd. Stop the fight against terrorism, remove our defenses, and you would not see stabilization. You would see anarchy. A few weeks ago, right after Britain's exit from the European Union, I said that even if the EU does not survive in its current form, you can be certain that something will replace it. A recent story in London Express said the foreign ministers of France and Germany are due to reveal a blueprint to effectively do away with individual member states in what is being described as the ultimatum. Under the radical proposals, EU countries will lose the right to have their own army, criminal law, taxation systems, or central bank, with all those powers being transferred to Brussels. Details for this new European supernation started coming out shortly after Britain's vote to leave the EU. It had been on the drawing board for at least a year. They didn't reveal it earlier because they knew it would push even more British voters to vote leave. In other words, they were trying to manipulate the vote. The elite's goal is not to remove all distinctions between the member states, but to minimize the importance of those distinctions. The plan calls for bringing Turkey into the fold. It also wants to expand EU influence globally, especially in Africa and the Middle East, and form an army of Europe. The superstate's army would not augment, but actually replace the militaries of the member states. That would render them powerless to act alone. The Treaty of Lisbon forms the constitutional basis for the European Union. Article 50 of the treaty allows members to do what Britain did, withdraw from the Union. But a European superstate would, in all practical ways, remove that option, and the grand new army of Europe would be used to enforce the new status quo. EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has been saying for several months that NATO is insufficient to meet Europe's security needs. In March, he said, a joint EU army would help us to form common foreign and security policies and allow Europe to take on responsibility in the world. EU officials are using the British exit as a reason to create the new army. This carries vast implications for world security. Retired British Army officer Colonel Richard Kemp wrote for the Telegraph, an EU army would undermine deterrence and cripple NATO, weakening European defenses when we face increasing threats from Russia, the Middle East, and radical Islam. Many prominent people believe that the EU will not survive in its current form, but some kind of united Europe is inevitable. Folks, despite what you may hear, the rumblings of the Antichrist have not diminished. They're increasing. Since the terrorist attacks on New York in 2001, the war on terror has been an important issue in every presidential campaign. President Obama is trying to dismiss concerns about terrorism. He wants us to see the topic in a bigger context. He assures us that despite what we may see on the news, his anti-terrorism policies are working. First, he wants us to realize that terrorism actually kills very few Americans. In fact, most people around the world presently have a better chance of being struck by lightning than dying at the hands of a terrorist. He also insists that the territory governed by ISIS is shrinking, at least for now. But do those facts really give us the big picture when it comes to terrorism? I don't think so. Let's do as the president says. Let's step back and take in the broad view of terrorism in the world today. While the number of cities governed by ISIS is shrinking, particularly in Iraq, the influence of radical Islam terrorism goes far beyond ISIS, Iraq, or Syria. Terrorist influence is growing in the area where terrorism does its greatest damage, in the minds and hearts of the terrorist enemies. In the last few days, entire malls have been evacuated because of shots fired. The problem is, shots were not fired. At a mall on Staten Island last week, and it was fireworks. At a North Carolina mall, also last week, people thought they heard shots and rushed for the exits. Where shots fired? So far, the investigation has been inconclusive. We know that 8 people were injured, not by shooting, but by the mayhem of people scrambling to get out of there. 2 terminals at Kennedy Airport were also evacuated last week because someone heard shots, but there were no shots. That's the new world in which we now live. Military bases have been closed off and evacuated because someone thought they saw a gun. In today's world, the threat of terror always feels close. Radical Islamic terrorists have succeeded in putting everyone on edge, and that's a big victory for them. They have also succeeded in something even more profound, Political correctness and the desire among Western leaders to seem open-minded have combined with the jihadist use of brute intimidation to make Islamic ideology off-limits to criticism. In one sense, the president is right. You probably will not be killed by Islamic terrorists, but your life has been changed by them. They have changed the world, and much for the worse. On the ground, Iraq has had some success recently. Primarily, the Iraqis retook the city of Fallujah, but their success came at a terrible price. They did it with the help of Shiite vigilante militias and the Iranian military. And Iraq is split down the middle when it comes to the fierce and ancient Muslim battle between Sunnis and Shiites. By defeating Sunni ISIS with the help of the Shiite militia and Shiite Iran, Iraqis are tearing open a gaping wound in their own country. And the problem doesn't stop in Iraq. More than 80% of the world's Muslims are Sunni. When Shiites gang up on Sunni ISIS, it is like opening terrorist recruiting stations in half the world's mosques. There's another way radical Islam terrorists are winning. This one may be the most disheartening of all. It is being accomplished with the aid of the European Union and the United States. Right now, the jihadists are in the middle of one of the most ambitious and audacious military operations in history. Syrian refugees and others from that region are being shipped into Europe and America by hundreds of thousands. ISIS does not have an air force, but it has something that may be even better. It has a cavalry of Trojan horses being welcomed as gifts into the cities of the world. Most Americans haven't heard of the refugee scandal going on right now in Twin Falls, Idaho. And it is unfolding in scores of other U.S. cities being inundated by refugees from Muslim nations. For the most part, these refugees are not happy to be in America. They are angry and frustrated. Twin Falls citizens have been spat upon by their new neighbors. There have been numerous reports of threats. At a grocery store, one of the refugees spat on a local woman and told her, "Your God is nothing. Allah is everything." Not long ago, there was a media storm in the Twin Falls area over 3 refugee boys accused of raping a 5-year-old girl. Police did not give details because the victim and all 3 boys are underage. With the help of some in the media, officials are trying to downplay it. The Idaho Statesman ran an article with the headline, "Story of Syrian Refugees Raping Idaho Girl is Wrong." Prosecutor says, that seemed to dismiss the whole report until it was realized that the boys accused of rape are not from Syria, but Sudan and Iraq. Carefully worded statements such as this weren't making the incident go away. So the federal government stepped in using another tactic, subversion of basic constitutional rights. The U.S. Attorney for Idaho, Wendy Olson, threatened the citizens of Twin Falls with prosecution for even talking about the refugee problem or a possible rape in their community. She said, the spread of the false information or inflammatory or threatening statements about the perpetrators or the crime itself reduces public safety and may violate federal law. That doesn't sound like the America I grew up in. Law professor Eugene Volokh wrote in the Washington Post, the prosecutor, a prosecutor backed by the might of the federal government, is not just condemning threatening statements. She is equally condemning inflammatory statements about the perpetrators or the crime, as well as the spread of false information. There is no First Amendment exception for inflammatory statements. It looks like an attempt to chill constitutionally protected speech through the threat of federal prosecution. In June, the United States accepted a record number of Syrian refugees. The Christian community in Syria is being decimated by ISIS. But unbelievably, only 8 of the refugees were Christians. Not 8%, but 8 individuals. 99% of the refugees were Muslims. Before the Civil War, 10% of Syrians were Christians. Is the American government blocking the Christian refugees? I think it's fair to surmise that the refugee program is about political power in the United States. It is not about helping the people who need it most. But here's the sad truth. While bringing tens of thousands of refugees into the U.S. causes great harm here, it doesn't even make a dent in the actual refugee problem. It's a mere token. The only effective way to help the millions of Syrians displaced by the Civil War is to help them in Syria. Western governments are spending billions of dollars to help these people, but only if they will give up their homes and come here. The administration seems to think that they can change the political complexion of communities by seeding them with people they think will one day become members of the president's political party. But in reality, they're sowing the seeds of terror. We're not used to receiving gifts without someone wanting something in return. That makes it hard for us to grasp that Jesus offers free salvation. In the back of many people's mind is the thought that there must be a hidden gimmick. No one gives something for nothing. But the redemption that Jesus made available to men at the cross is a love gift. There's no fine print in the contract of salvation. It doesn't even say that we have to give Him ourselves. All we're asked to do is receive by faith the gift of His pardon. And when we do that, we begin to enjoy the freedoms of a new heart. And guess what? That new heart will want to follow God. As Paul wrote, "But now, having been freed from sin and enslaved to God, you derive your benefit resulting in sanctification and the outcome, eternal life." Jesus said, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." John wrote, "But as many as received Him, to them He gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in His name." Here again, we ask only to believe in what Jesus did for us in providing our liberation at the cross. Then God gives us the power to become His children. We must realize, though, that to express our faith, we need to tell God in our own words what we're doing. Just simply say, "Father, I receive Jesus Christ, and I receive the forgiveness that He died on the cross to pay for. Please come into my heart. Make me what you want me to be. Amen." Well, that's it for tonight, folks. God willing, I'll see you next week.
You've been watching the Hal Lindsey Report. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsey Media Ministries, P.O. Box 470470, Tulsa, Oklahoma 74147. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsey.com or call 1-888-RAPTURE.